Hello, everyone. It's such an honor and privilege for me to be here at the Ed Universal World Convention on globalization and higher education. Today, I'm going to talk about crisis leadership and the role that negotiation plays in crisis leadership. Before I actually start talking about crisis leadership, let's look at the history of leadership briefly. Earlier, whenever we thought of leaders, we always thought of leaders as either heroes or martyrs. So, therefore, our entire premise for leaders was that they ought to shed blood, either of other people or of themselves for the sake of a cause. And then, subsequently, when we start looking at leaders in the world of business, we started boxing them into compartments like there are leaders who are charismatic, there are leaders who are transactional, there are leaders who are transformational. And then we came up with a definition that said that leadership is a process by which a person influences others to accomplish an objective and directs the organization in such a way that makes it cohesive and coherent. However, then entered the VUCA world, and suddenly we were dealing from one crisis and we were going from one crisis to the other. We were dealing with a lot of crises. There was volatility, there was uncertainty, there was complexity, and there was ambiguity. And all of this related to a conflict. And this is where negotiation comes in. Because if you look at conflict, conflict is defined as differences in and among individuals. I can have conflicts within me, I can have conflicts with other people. If I'm a part of a group or a collective, there could be a conflict within the collective, and then there could be conflict between collectives, and those collectives could be your family, your department, your organization, your state, your country, so on and so forth. Now, there are many ways of resolving a conflict. Conflict can be resolved by using force, like some people or some organizations tend to do. Conflicts can be resolved by doing nothing and hoping that the conflict will go away on its own. But with increasing psychological maturity, conflicts are best resolved through negotiation. And therefore, today I'm going to talk about negotiation and in particular, negotiating ability, which is a set of strengths which actually make person help negotiate crises and conflicts better. And this, by the way, happens to be a result of my own thesis and research work. Now, according to my research, the negotiating ability has 5 dimensions, and for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about these 5 dimensions of negotiation. The first dimension of negotiation is artfulness, which is the elements of shrewdness and calculatedness whenever it comes to conflicts or crises. How much can you anticipate? How much can you predict what is going to happen? What are the consequences of your actions going to happen in the near term, in the middle term, and in the long term? And for that, what you need to have is ability to manage expectations. Please remember that when you're in the middle of the crisis, there are several stakeholders, and all of them have certain expectations from you. And particularly, remember that you will always play a role. You could be playing the role of a leader, you could be playing the role of a subordinate, you could be playing the role of a family person, you could be playing the role of an individual who's a part of a larger collective. And when it comes to these roles, there are 2 attributes of these roles which become extremely important. One is role perception and the other is role expectation. Role perception is how you believe a role ought to be played out, a role ought to be carried out. And role expectation is how does the other person or the rest of the world believe this role ought to be played out. And more often than not, there is a discrepancy between the two. They're not the same. And therefore, developing this ability to manage the difference between role perception and role expectation for all the stakeholders. This is the first thing that you need to develop so as to develop on the dimension of artfulness in the negotiating ability. The second dimension of negotiating ability is diplomacy. Diplomacy. This dimension represents to diplomacy, tact, sensitivity, and the ability to look at issues with acutely penetrating mental discernment. Now here lies the most important element of negotiation, and that is reflective listening. There are two kinds of listeners in this world. One who listen to respond, and the other who listen to understand. Unfortunately, most people belong to the former category. They are the ones that when a time of crisis comes and somebody asks them a question, their mind immediately goes on to look for a witty answer, to look for an appropriate answer, to figure out how to respond to that particular question rather than to understand what does the person really want. And herein comes a very fundamental finding that I had with my own research in negotiation and conflict management. And that was that the apparent reason of the conflict is hardly ever the real reason of the conflict. Which means when people come to you with their problems, when people talk to you about a conflict, more often than not, what they are talking to you about is something that in negotiation theory we call position, which is posturing, which is something that they believe they want. However, if you dig deeper, if you try to understand clearly, if you ask them open-ended questions, if you listen carefully, then you will listen to the real need that they have, the real interest that they have, or the real problem that they have during the time of the crisis. So developing this ability is a part of the dimension of diplomacy. The third dimension of negotiating ability is detachedness, which is all about rational thinking and deliberation and dissociating judgment from desire. And to be able to be good at this, you need to be devoid of ego and you need to act only after due deliberation, which means never ever focus on the person. If at all you're negotiating with somebody, if at all you are in a conflicting situation with somebody, don't focus on the person. Don't point a finger at the individual. Rather, keep the focus on the issue at hand. At this point, let me tell you an experience that I had in very early days of my academic career. I worked with the corporate sector for about 8.5 years and then I shifted to academia. Now, my first consultancy assignment that I got when I came to the academic world was to actually hammer out the terms and conditions for a sale of a public sector company which was being sold to a private sector company. And my job was to hammer out the terms and conditions. I reached this place and I was talking to the CMD of this company when there was a knock on the door. The CMD went and opened the door and there was a mob of very angry people. These were the employees of that company who said that they did not want the company to be sold to a private entity. Now, while I was talking to them, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of pushing around, there was a lot of heckling, but I kept my cool. I did not bring my ego in. Rather, I brought those people in and started having a conversation. Within 10 minutes, the ice broke, the tensions actually went away, and then came out the real reason, and the real reason was that the people thought that when the sale would happen to a private organization, it would actually lead to job attrition, there would be job losses, the new company is going to fire the old employees. And therefore, the moment the real reason came, then was the time to negotiate and figure out how can we keep all the employees of the previous organization on the board in the new management while coming up with new terms and conditions. The moral of the story is, if you don't bring your ego in, if you act only after due deliberation without thinking that you know it all, if you make sure that you're listening to understand the real thing, and if you make sure that you anticipate the consequences of whatever it is that you're going to do a priori, you will be far more successful in dealing with a crisis, even if it's a personal crisis like you being surrounded by a mob. The fourth dimension of negotiation is fair-mindedness. This is all about selflessness and making decisions that are equitable. And I think the most important element that you need to practice over here is to not bring your personal agendas as a leader. When you are in a leadership position, you have to make sure that you put the agenda of the collective before your personal agenda, before your personal interest. And particularly in the time of crisis, it becomes extremely important because people are looking up to you. People are watching you very, very carefully as to how are you going to handle things during crisis, because you may not have the time to actually have prolonged discussions during the time of the crisis, and you may need to act swiftly and decisively. And therefore, whether you are furthering the cause of the organization or the collective, or whether you are trying to further your own self-interest, is something that everyone would be watching very carefully. So make sure that you do not bring your personal agendas and try to build a consensus. And finally, and the fifth dimension of negotiating ability is sagacity. Sagacity is about reliance on your own counsel apart from the rule book, which means don't get stuck so much by the letter of the law that you completely forget what the spirit of the law is. And the most important element of skill that you need to work on when it comes to sagacity is maintaining personal integrity. Remember one thing, as a leader during the time of a crisis, do not expect the other people to do what you yourself are not willing to do. And more importantly, be the first person to do what you expect others to do. When you do that, the employees or the subordinates, whoever it is that you're leading, whatever collective that you're a part of, they start trusting you. They start having more confidence in you. And this trust and confidence is at the core of crisis leadership. So these were the 5 dimensions of negotiating ability, which if we bring in, we will be able to negotiate through crisis very, very well. And the final element of this entire discourse on crisis leadership and negotiation is the issue of communication. Many a times we underestimate the power of communication, but please remember, during the time of a crisis, communication plays a very significant role. You know, communication, the word which is etymologically derived from the Latin communis, means to share or to make common. And what is it that we are sharing? What is it that we are making common? We are actually sharing messages, which means communication is a process where we exchange messages through a medium. However, there is one element of communication which we need to be very, very careful about. And that is, communication has to be kinesthetic. There are 3 elements that actually participate in communication: our heart, our mind, and our intellect. Whatever goes on in our intellect, in our communication, gets manifested through words. Whatever happens in our mind, in our communication, gets manifested through our body language. And whatever happens in our heart, in communication, gets manifested through our facial expressions and the tone and tenor of the voice. And therefore, what I mean by this is that whenever you are communicating, make sure that you're saying the same thing with your heart, mind, and intellect. Which means make sure that your body language, your facial expressions, your tone and tenor of the voice, and your words are all in sync. They are all in consonance. You are saying exactly the same thing. For example, if I were to come here and tell you people at this convention, hey, I never get angry. Now, I'm saying I never get angry, but clearly my body language and my expression is that of anger. And this does not work in the time of crisis, because people are not merely listening to your words, they're also watching you. They're also looking at you. They're also listening to the tone of your voice. And therefore, the tone, tenor, and the body language of your voice becomes extremely important whenever you are communicating in the time of the crisis. And the second element of communication, which is equally important, is how are you framing your communication? How do you frame your communication in the time of a crisis? For example, if at all there is a crisis and you want people to follow certain norms, we can take the example of COVID. You want people to wear masks. You want people to keep a physical distance. You want people to maintain some kind of a hand hygiene. In that case, if you communicate to the people saying that, look, if you do not follow these norms, we are going to lose 20% of the people. There would be a casualty of 20%. Vis-a-vis, if you tell the people that if you follow these norms, at least 80% of the population is going to be unscathed. we are going to save 80% of the people. What research says is that the latter communication is more agreeable, more acceptable, and is more likely to end up in action than the former communication. Which means people like a framing to be positive. They are moved, they are motivated, they are influenced to actually be persuaded into action if the framing is positive. And therefore, to sum it all up, in the time of crisis, leadership matters a lot. At the core of leadership is negotiating with all the stakeholders of the crisis. At the core of negotiation are the ability dimensions of negotiating ability, and those are the 5 dimensions of artfulness, diplomacy, detachedness, fair-mindedness, and sagacity. And one of the important elements when it comes to crisis leadership is that of communication. And communication is all about the way you speak, your body language, and the way you frame your entire communication. So I hope to all the leaders out there that you will use this particular method, you will use these dimensions to further hone your leadership skills. Once again, it's such a pleasure to be a part of the EdUniversal World Convention. Thank you very much for this patient listening.